And on our panel here, the Housing Minister, Grant Shapps, the Shadow Attorney General, Emily Thornberry, the President of the Liberal Democrats, Tim Farron, the Mail on Sunday columnist, Peter Hitchens, and the former Director General of the BBC, who the Prime Minister today said was no shrinking violet, Greg Dyke. Thank you very much. Our first question comes from Eleanor Walker, please. Eleanor Walker.
Is it appropriate for Rebekah Brooks and David Cameron to be professionally, definitely in this together?
This is, of course, the tweet that came from Rebekah Brooks to David Cameron when he was about to make his big speech, his text message saying, "We're definitely in this together, speech of your life, yes, he can." OK, well, we'll go to our non-shrinking violet.
Do I think yes, I find it quite difficult, that, because clearly politicians over many years have had relationships with newspaper executives. And I have no idea in which context that was sent, but seems to me it was sent at a time when the Sun had come out and said, we're going to support the Conservatives. What I think is much more important than what is in odd emails and odd things is actually what we've seen from the whole inquiry, and what many of us have known for many years, is that the relationship between the political classes, and particularly between government and News International, has undermined our democracy over 20, 30 years.
And that's surely what Eleanor Walker means.
Yes, that's part of it. But in the end, we know that it mattered too much to politicians, if they're in opposition or they're in government. It mattered too much to them. They believed that they had to get the Sun and News International on side. And that is very damaging for our society. Now, actually, I think it's gone. I think it's actually, we're sitting at a very interesting moment where I'm not sure it will be replicated again. And I think that's why what's happening at the moment is important, that something that has grown up almost from the Thatcher period right the way through, I think with the honourable exception probably of John Major, where every Prime Minister or every leader of the opposition tried to get a relationship with News International, I think that has gone. And I think the day that David Cameron stood up in the House of Commons and said, we've all been too close and it's got to end, I think was a very important moment.
The woman up there in the second row from the back.
Surely the people in politics shouldn't be thinking about getting the newspapers on their side as much as they should be thinking about doing the jobs that they're supposed to be doing, regardless of what the newspapers think of them.
Tim Farron.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is that we're being told that the Leveson inquiry shouldn't, end up in any restrictions on the independence of the media. But how independent is the media when you've got chief executives and owners of huge media organisations who have politicians in their pockets? If I'm honest with you, I'm not all that...
Sorry, is that what you're saying Rebekah Brooks had?
She had.
In the case of David Cameron?
Absolutely. I mean, over the last 30 years, the other two parties have spent, taken it in turns to be in Murdoch's top pocket. And that is an absolute outrage. And I'm not all that fussed about, politicians and journalists being a bit chummy. I don't want the outcome of the Leveson inquiry to be some kind of set of protocols about how often you can have a pint with a journalist. The reality is, this is about the concentration and the abuse of unelected power. And what we've got here is a monopoly. We've got manipulation of unelected power. It's about Murdoch, and all those three must be tackled. This is the one opportunity we're going to get in generations to tackle the power of Murdoch and that unelected power, and we must not miss it.
So I think I quote him correctly, Grant Shapps, what Tim just said, that Cameron was in Brooks's top pocket.
Well, look, I mean, if it were, then it was only about a day old at the time of that text. The history, of course, was that the Sun newspaper in particular had been supporting Labour, famously supported Tony Blair, who flew halfway around the world to court Murdoch. And this was the moment at which the Sun decided to stop supporting Labour and a day or two later declare around that time for the Conservatives. So, look, I mean, to answer the lady's point before about the newspapers and what politicians should spend their time doing, I absolutely agree, and particularly ministers like me, we should spend our time trying to make things better, run the country, doing our jobs. One of the other things you have to do is explain to people why you're taking a particular course of action, what the reason for that approach is, and that, I'm afraid, involves modern communication, one of which is you need to let people know, and one very good way to do that is through the newspapers. It's not my favourite way of doing it. I much prefer to tweet what I'm doing, but unless you're not following me on, if you're not following me on Twitter, you won't know about it. So in the end, you have to have those conversations with the media.
Let's just go to the question, Grant. Is it appropriate for Rebekah Brooks and David Cameron to be, quotes, professional indefinitely in this together? What do they mean by that?
I think simply that the newspaper had decided that they were going to back, in this particular case, switch their backing from Labour to Conservatives, that they're in it together wanting the same outcome, which is to be able to put a Conservative manifesto.
Was it appropriate, the relationship, and is it embarrassing now? Were you embarrassed hearing the Prime Minister on the stand today?
I think that everybody agrees that politicians were too close over a long period of time, and that Greg Dyke's absolutely right that the moment that David Cameron, this Prime Minister, who, by the way, when he stood up and said this, must have known that all of this is very likely to come out, at least suspected it would do, that actually it's time to put an end to all of this.
When he stood up and said
the relationship has been too close.
When he announced the inquiry?
The Leveson inquiry.
He knew he'd be there having these embarrassing things
he could have set, bear this in mind for a moment. He could have set up a review that said the terms of this review are only to look at the media. And remember, this all started over people's revolt and disgust over some of the excesses of the media that led to a dead girl's voicemail being listened into. Now, everyone agreed the media had gone too far, and he could have defined the terms of Leveson only to investigate the media, but he did not deliberately, because the relationship between politicians and the media over generations has been too tight, too close, and this is just an example of that, and it's good that he announced the inquiry and it's doing its job.
Isn't this whole Leveson inquiry a case of the chattering classes scrutinising its own navel? The ordinary man, I would say, on Teesside and in Stockton on Tees, isn't going to bed every night and losing sleep over this matter, and yet it dominates our television screens hour after hour after hour. There are far more important questions which ordinary men and women in our society have to worry about, and yet yourselves, top politicians and people involved in the media seem to be totally absorbed with this particular item. And I think it's time you thought about things like unemployment, the Eurozone, housing, and many other things which really affect ordinary people.
Absolutely. I absolve question time of this crime because we had a lot of questions about it tonight from our audience here, which is why we're discussing it. Emily Thornberry.
I think actually some of what you say is absolutely true. I think, though, that if you ask the public, they think, well, politicians and the press have been too close for too long. That's a given. But I think if we look into what Leveson is about in terms of now, as opposed to, history, but what is Leveson about in terms of now and the future, there are some very important things to look at. We are basically, I think the most important thing about Leveson is that it shows us what the Prime Minister's real judgment is. He employed Coulson at a time when there was increasing scandal about hacking, and hacking had taken place under Coulson. He continued to employ Coulson after there was stuff in the New York Times, and continued for more than a year to employ him, when there were accusations flying around. He continued to be very close friends with Rebekah Brooks during the whole hacking scandal. There is that part, the judgment of someone keeping so close to journalists involved in that sort of thing, and essentially taking Coulson into number 10 and therefore taking, let's not beat around the bush, taking the Murdochs into number 10, into the heart of government. The other thing which I think, and why do the Murdochs want to come into the heart of government? Well, clearly they're very interested, but the major reason for them in terms of a business is because this government had to make a decision about an £8 billion deal, and to have your friends so close on this deal, and then to employ Hunt and to give Hunt the job of making the decision about this £8 billion
They
here.
didn't employ
When you know,
they employed Vince Cable, didn't you?
They
didn't employ him.
Yeah, and then when you have a decision to make, you decide to have Hunt, even though Hunt is
Why
the one.
did they give it to Vince Cable if they wanted it to go through?
No, I haven't suggested that. But what I'm saying
why did they give it to Vince Cable? You said they employed Hunt.
Yeah, they employed. No, they did.
Second, they chose Vince Cable first, and it wasn't until Vince Cable said that he was out to get Murdoch that he didn't get the gig.
And you'll remember that when they'd employed Vince Cable, Hunt had written to the Prime Minister saying, in words, I'm very worried about this. Can we have a meeting, the Prime Minister and Vince Cable and the Deputy Prime Minister, to discuss the issues? And even though he's trying to intervene in that way, later on, when Vince Cable has to go, who gets the job? Jeremy Hunt.
All right. Peter Hitchens.
Well, first of all, can we get rid of this horrible expression, appropriate or inappropriate, and return to those nice, simple words, right and wrong? Was it right or was it wrong? Secondly, it seems obvious to me that the proper relationship between the press and politicians is that between a dog and a lamppost. Always should be, most of the time has been, and I do feel that it was extraordinarily unwise in getting so close to somebody for a senior newspaper executive to get so close to the government, to actually put themselves so very much in the government's pocket that they became effectively a part of government. And I remember the day that The Sun came out with its ridiculous trumpeting of praise for David Cameron, and the absurd semi-literate article which he penned, in which the main burden of it was that he was suddenly converted to the ludicrous cause of our war in Afghanistan, for which people are still dying today, even though he can't, when asked, explain why British troops are there. I do think that there's something very unhealthy about journalists actually becoming servants of government. I think that's one of the worst things about this. But there is another point. The gentleman at the top of the hall said that we should be discussing more important things. And I don't disagree with him that there are more important subjects than a lot of what's come up at the Leveson inquiry. But it does seem to me that freedom of the press is a very important part of our liberties. And the Leveson inquiry is constructing a coffin for freedom of press, freedom of the press in this country. It is absolutely amazing to watch politicians who are proposing to institute surveillance on everybody's phone calls, emails, and computer activity, launching an inquiry into the press because of phone hacking. Now, the thing about phone hacking is it's absolutely disgraceful and wrong, but it is against the law. And if you have been caught doing it and prosecuted for it and convicted for it, you will go to prison. There is no politicians' complaints commission. There isn't anything you can do about the politicians who fail you. There isn't actually much you can do about judges who fail you either. And yet here we have lawyers and judges happily smiling together as they prepare regulations which will make a free press in this country impossible. That is important. I think you should bear it very strongly in mind.
Thank you. I'll take a couple more points and then we'll go on. The man with spectacles in the back row there. In the very back row. With
these long drawn-out public inquiries, such as Hutton and Leveson, the politicians never seem to get any blame, do they? With Hutton, it was widely regarded as a whitewash. What's going to happen with Leveson? The politicians aren't going to get any blame from Leveson, are they?
Greg Dyke?
No. Well, as the person who did get the blame, I think what matters in all this is what comes out of it. I think the popular press in this country has been out of control for 20 years, and not all the time, but a lot of the time. And I think what has to come out of this is a proper system whereby an individual can complain, that complaint is properly investigated, and if it's investigated and it's found that wrong has been done, there is some sort of compensation. Now that seems to me, that's all you need to get out of this. You need to get, it's nothing about censorship, it's nothing about stopping you writing what you want to write, it's about saying, is what you've done fair, is it right, is it proper? And if it's not, you have got to compensate.
I think it's amazing to hear that coming from a former Director General of the BBC, an organisation to which it is almost impossible to complain about anything. You can't even get through to it most of the time, which is itself enormously powerful and insensitive to
there was a complete
public
in the
opinion.
BBC. There always was, and there is a complete complaints process, and there is a right of appeal to Ofcom if you're not.
Well,
happy.
you've obviously never used it, but if you had, you'd know how much use that was. But I'm also amazed about this huge fuss about the Murdoch empire being very close to prime ministers. Before the last election, David Cameron had a meeting with the present Director General of the BBC in his offices in the Palace of Westminster, and I tried, and a colleague of mine tried, through Freedom of Information, to find out what had taken place at that meeting, and they wouldn't tell us, because the BBC is exempt from freedom of information in such queries, and wasn't in any way obliged to tell us. Yet the BBC is paid for by everybody in this country through a poll tax. I think that's much more important, actually, than a lot of what we're discussing.
I don't know. Certainly, in the time I was there, I think I have had one meeting with the Prime Minister. He wanted to have a meeting with me after I'd left, but I didn't. I chose not to have it.
But when did you have a meeting with him, and what was it about? And can you remember the date and who was there?
No, I took a decision.
He doesn't recollect that.
I took a decision when I was Director General that I would stay as far away from the politicians in government as I could. And that's the decision I took, because I think there is a danger of being compromised.
OK. But it mustn't go on forever. A quick one from you, and a quick one from you, Grant, and then we'll move on. I want to come to you, sir.
I think the real danger, to answer a point made earlier on, which is a good one about this, is that the Leveson inquiry does become something which political obsessives spend all their time concentrating on. And what happens over a period of time is we just all get outrage fatigue. We're a little bit bored by the whole thing. And it isn't esoteric. I mean, this might be a thing for chattering classes, but who owns our media massively matters, because Rupert Murdoch has been dictating the terms of debate for this country for 30 years. And you talk about unemployment, the health service, the economy. What governments do on those issues is dictated by this man who's not even a British citizen, so it's nothing esoteric about that.
So are the Liberal Democrats going to agree with Ed's suggestion that the ownership should be between 20 and 30%?
We've been calling for this about 30 years, Emily.
So we're going to vote together on that?
I wonder if Ed Miliband said this when he was having, schmoozing over drinks and nibbles with Rupert Murdoch at his garden party last.
Oh, come on, you're just jealous. It's only because you're such a small party.
Nobody cares about it.
You haven't had
Don't forget.
So, Grant Shapps, again, you heard what he said, that government policies on all these key issues are dictated by the press.
Well, look, if they were, then we'd be doing probably a lot better in the polls. I just don't think that's the case at all. We don't spend all our time chasing...
Why would you be doing a lot better in the polls?
Because if it were dictated by the press, then you presumably would be doing all the things that they want you to do all the time. But actually governing's for the long term. And rather than
I'm not with you at all. You mean that if you did what the Daily Mail said or the Guardian said...
If you simply...
I didn't follow you at all.
If you simply did exactly what every single campaign wanted to do in the newspapers, then actually, presumably, you might be doing better in the short term. My point is, being in government's about the long-term stuff, like fixing the massive deficit, or all the other things we may actually get on to talking about. But I do want to pick up one quick point. Peter, I think you're wrong about the way this is likely to end up in terms of press censorship. I see no chance whatsoever. In fact, everybody, I think including the Prime Minister today, has made the point that we thrive in this country from having a vibrant press. That's not the same as tapping into people's voicemails, and there's a very, very clear distinction between the two. And this whole process has meant that actually every single contact that I have with a senior journalist or an editor, and same with everybody else who helps run this country, is now routinely released. And I think that's a thoroughly good outcome so far from Leveson.
Thank you, and I promised you a quick line, sir, if you would.
There's nothing corrupts like absolute power. And I believe here that this government has been tainted by the man who had the power in the media.
OK. At that point, we'll leave Murdoch and the rest. But if you're tweeting, remember our hashtag is BBCQT. If you prefer, you can text us, 83981, with your opinions, and press the red button to see what others are saying. We've got a question now from Nigel Jessup, please. Nigel Jessup.
Do you agree with Community Secretary Eric Pickles that problem families have had it easy for too long?
Problem families have had it easy for too long. Eric Pickles, the Community Secretary, has said that it was costing £9 billion a year. 120,000 troubled families were costing the state £9 billion a year, £75,000 a family, and he's about to spend £500,000 with local councils on trying to resolve the problem. Tim Farron, are you with him on this?
Well, I mean, the reality is there are plenty of people who have enormous difficulties when it comes to poverty, housing, educational need. It's not good to stigmatise them, though. As somebody who was, you know, brought up...
Neighbours from hell, David Cameron referred to them.
Yeah,
with that?
Indeed. I mean, I think...
Is that stigmatising?
I think, it does sometimes. But I mean, it depends on where you live. And, you know, somebody who's brought up in the north of England under, you know, in Thatcher's Britain, if you like, over the other side of the Pennines. You know, my mum spent some time out of work. I recognise that, you know, the pressures that lots of families that are not so well off face. It's wrong to stigmatise them. It's right to help them. And if this does mean that money will be directed through local authorities to help those families and to help people who are struggling, then that is a good thing. But you don't make things better by demonising people.
Right. So we're talking about the government which your party supports. Was Eric Pickles right to say that the programme will be more forceful in language, a little less understanding?
Well, I think we need to be very understanding.
A little less understanding, you said.
I mean, I don't know, how do you gauge how understanding you are? I mean, the reality is we want to be effective, don't we? And I'm suggesting that whilst I think the programme is right, the rhetoric sometimes is not right.
Peter Hitchens?
Well, I don't think it's anything... we're entitled to sit here, any of us, and start saying anybody is having it easy in the poorer parts of our country. That's not the point. The point is whether they are being given the sort of help they really need. I don't think that compassion should necessarily be expressed by throwing money at these people. I think that Eric Pickles probably feels the same way, but because this government is in effect a fraud which makes conservative statements and does no conservative things, nothing will come of this. But I think that his general idea that what we need to do is to look at the reasons why we have so many problem families, which are fundamentally the destruction of the married family by the deliberate subsidising of fatherless families and an enormous welfare-dependent class, then we might be able to do some good. But it doesn't do any good being rude to people. Except to politicians who deserve it. It doesn't do any good being rude to people who are at the bottom end of society. Many of them are acting perfectly rationally. If you create an enormous welfare state, people will obviously go and collect the welfare which is offered to them, and they will behave in the way which the welfare state persuades them to do. That's why we're in such a mess. But until we get serious welfare reform aimed at bringing back the solid family life which people used to enjoy in this country and which used to be particularly good for the upbringing of children, then these problems will persist. And I just think Eric Pickles is showing off and pretending to be a conservative without actually being one, and offending people without doing any good.
You, sir?
I find it quite amazing that we're focusing on welfare when the recent study found that that chief executives in the FTSE 100 companies have increased their salaries by an average of 12%. Surely if that money was redistributed, there'll be less people on welfare and more people being able to get off welfare and get jobs and be able to cope better in the recession.
Well, no, if the money were redistributed, thered be more people on welfare, wouldn't there? Because there'd be more money to spend on it.
In terms of what? In terms of chief executives here?
Before I came along today, I was advised to do, you know, yoga, deep breathing, and to make sure I didn't get wound up by Peter Hitchens. But I just have already, and we're only on the second question. I suppose that given that my family that I was brought up in was fatherless, and I suppose the fact that my mother was on benefits and we lived in a council estate means that we were one of the problem families that you talk about, Peter. But actually, do you know what? We had a solid family life, and we did well, and me and my brothers did well, and my mum struggled. And how dare you say that women and single parents on council estates living on benefits are therefore by definition problem families? How dare you?
Well, actually,
how dare you?
Had I said any such thing, your phony outrage would be justified. But as I didn't, it isn't. And you really do need to do a bit better than
I made a note.
Yes.
I made a note. You talked about problem families being fatherless, and you talked about them being on benefits. And that describes the family life. That describes me as a child. And we were not a problem family.
It's a subject under discussion. I didn't say anything about your family or anything of the kind. You're just engaging in phony outrage.
I am not
for
engaging
political
in phony
propaganda
outrage.
purposes, which is what your party always does.
The woman there in the grey dress.
Pathetic rubbish.
Peter, just to put things into perspective, I'm a HR professional who was made redundant 3 years ago, and I've been in and out of interim work while I'm doing my masters at university. I'm a single parent. My ex-husband is travelling around the world earning lots and lots of money tax-free. Now, I work very hard. I have to go down to a job centre and beg for very little bit of money on the welfare state. I have to go through such bureaucracy, it's unbelievable. I'm in there, third time unemployed in 3 years, and I'm sitting there watching young people being interrogated and treated like something would be on the bottom of your shoe. It's absolutely disgusting. The people in there aren't capable of giving advice on recruitment, employment, finding work. There is work out there, but they're not giving the right guidance. And I think it's terrible what you're saying.
All right. Hold it, Peter. Grant Shapps. You're in this government. Do you want to answer her point?
Well, first of all, just the definition of this. I absolutely agree with you, Emily. This has nothing to do with people who have one or two parents, who are rich or poor or anything else. What we're talking about are the 120,000 families who are identifiable as being in deep difficulty, deep trouble, and creating problems that, if you happen to live in that community, are responsible for 80% of the problems around you in that community. And I don't think there's any reason why people in this country should have to put up with living next door in the same street as people who are causing so much disruption to ordinary people's lives. And we have a duty and a responsibility to do something about that. You mentioned correctly, David, that this costs £9 billion a year in terms of the costs of clearing up this mess.
I didn't mention it correctly. I quoted what you had said.
Yeah. 9 billion.
Which will therefore be accurate.
But you incorrectly mentioned that we were spending £500,000. It's 500 million on it, £500 million, in other words.
That's what I said,
£500 million. Oh, you said £500,000.
But your statistics are dodgy, aren't they? I mean, you've got problems with your statistics. I mean, I don't really understand where it comes from. And the government has been asked, and they can't
let me explain. Because all of
where the
I want you to go back to the young woman sitting there and what she said, which was very powerful a moment ago, and you heard. What's your answer?
The service has got to be... Well, can I just finish the first point and then I'll do the second? The first point is the money is being spent through local councils. Every council, including all of yours, Emily, have signed up to deliver this. And if they get the result, in other words, get people out of crime, get the kids back to school, then there's a payment by result. It means that the money goes to the council having solved the problem. Far better than spending £9 billion a year on a merry-go-round through the courts, the police and all the rest of it as the disruption goes on. And with reference to your point, I mean, it's very sad to hear when you go for help and you're trying to do the right thing yourself and you go there, if you're not getting the level of professionalism that you should be through Job Centre Plus. I know that there are, it varies, it depends where you go. There's some brilliant professionals in some of those Job Centre Plus centres.
Over 500 retail shops. I had a large role that covered from Lincoln right to Aberdeen across to Manchester.
Yeah.
And there is, it's the same.
Well, you know what? I think people deserve the best possible advice. It's tough times out there. There are something like 450,000 vacancies in the Job Centre Plus system right now. And, there have been a couple of better months of job figures with unemployment falling for a couple of months. We need really great services to make sure that people are connected. And, it saddens me when I hear that's not the case.
Well, this coalition government took 10,000 jobs out of the service 2 years ago, and they're now putting 4,000 jobs back in. But I don't believe that, that they're looking at really the real type of work.
Well, I mean, look, we can trade figures all day long. The fact of the matter is, no matter what everyone else says, anything else you say, the country was going to the wall, and if we didn't take action, we'd be like Greece today, or Spain today, or Italy today, and the list goes on and on. It's absolutely true, Emily. The country would
we were never going to be like.
Yes, we were. Our deficit was just as big. We'll get onto it.
I think there should be a self-denying ordinance on panellists saying the fact of the matter is. The woman in blue there.
Okay. I'm a children's counsellor in Hartlepool, and I used to use one of the libraries in Hartlepool for my work. What concerns me is that David Cameron spent a lot of time talking about the big society, and you, Grant, you said about we need the services. The library that I used to work in was a wonderful big society, all of its own. The elderly around the corner read the newspapers, children came and used it, other people came and used computers there. It had a yoga group, a book club and an embroidery group. and it was closed down because of the cuts. I find that incredibly short-termism, that everybody wants. Actually, what we all need to do in society is to contribute. That's what people need.
Can I bring? I'm sorry. I want to bring you back to the question, which where this discussion started, about so-called problem families and what's being done there.
Well, it feels like these services are being taken away from the families that you're talking about.
Well, and yet I've been in Stockton-Tees town centre today, and the library's opened up with new facilities. So, you know, obviously libraries are important. They're one part of the patchwork, and whatever Emily tries to tell you, this country could not carry on spending money that our children will have to pay back.
Can we start over again?
No, Greg Dyke.
It saddens me it ends up in this sort of political debate, because there is an issue. We all know there's an issue of an underclass who got left behind in this country. And I don't think we have ever worked out or know what to do about it. I think the Labour government threw a lot of money at it, and I don't think that solved the problem. And what I would like to see it taken out of the political debate, accept there is a problem, have a proper study and work out what do you do about it. Because I think, truthfully, I don't think Pickle's line helps at all. I think you've got to actually try and say, what do you do about 150,000, 200,000 families who are not part of our society? They're separated from it, and that is and people know it's there, and you've just got to try to work out what we've got to understand it, work out what can we do about it without having the sort of political banter we're having here.
Well, the problem with that is that if you try and suggest what you should do about it, you get buckets of slime chucked over you by Labour politicians, and there's an end to it. There is a simple problem. Almost all serious work on the problems of problem families, the phrase not introduced into this discussion by me, in any major country, any major advanced country, will tell you that these problems are concentrated where there are no fathers. And if you won't do anything about that, then indeed, if you continue to pursue policies which create more and more fatherless families, you'll get more of it. Right. I'll carry on saying it however many times people chuck buckets of slime over me for saying it, because it is important and needs to be addressed.
The woman in orange there.
I think that's a classic example of the media having too much power, actually, what you've just said there. But
I wish I did have power.
Going back to the sort of welfare reforms, be it the issue about problem families, do you not think that we should make long-term decisions and not short-term decisions for political gain, and actually base those decisions about welfare reforms on what works, what is effective? Absolutely. And surely that's not down to political whim. It should be down to what is evidence-based.
Okay, and the woman in the centre there.
Going on what the gentleman at the end said about the fatherless families making up a lot of the problem families in the region, we actually, me and my mum, who's here too, we actually ran a charity called Cleveland Child Contact Centres, who runs supported contact centres, in order to bring children and their fathers or mothers, whoever they were estranged from, together. And in January this year, we closed because we had no money. So as to what this gentleman here said, where is he's saying it's cost £500 million to sort out these problem families, but where is it going? We have no money. We were trying to help in the society, but we have no money. We've closed, so where is all this money going?
Well, you better ask Mr. Farron and Mr. Shapps, because they're actually borrowing more money at the moment than the previous government was. They pretend to be cutting spending. They're rolling in.
Thank you, Peter. The man up on the right there.
It's not about whether you're a single parent or whether you're rich or poor. I've been involved in regeneration of a poor council estate, which I grew up on. And the council estate went down the pan. And it went down the pan largely because of the social problems on the estate. It had nothing to do with what money you had or anything like that. It was down to a handful of families that dragged the estate down to its knees. We used to go around knocking on people's doors. They were undoing about 5 and 6 bolts off the door to undo it. There was drugs, there was people twacking. Small amounts, but these decent people that were living in these properties had a living nightmare. Yeah. So if you turn your back on this and say that this doesn't exist, it does exist. I'm no lover of pickles, far from it. Yeah. But there's people out there hell-bent on destroying decent people's lives.
Yeah. Absolutely. Okay. Yeah. Absolutely. Right. Let's go on to another question. This from Phil Bernarges, please.
Can the panel please recite a poem that they learnt by rote at school and explain how this has been useful in their subsequent careers?
This, of course, is because Michael Gove is suggesting a new national curriculum which includes plans for children at 5 to learn and recite poetry and other things, to spell words that I can't quite spell and learn a foreign language and all sorts of other things. Which poor sap is going to have to start on this one? Grant Shapps, can you recite a poem you learned by rote at school and tell us how useful it was?
Twinkle, twinkle, little star. I can't, actually, and it's probably been my undoing. I think that what Michael Gove...
feeble effort that was.
Oh, sorry. What Michael... We're going to test you next. What Michael Gove wants to do is kind of get school children learning the basics. So you come out with the ability to kind of add up, to be able to read, to write, to a sort of proficient level. And I started a printing company 20-something years ago, and I remember the frustration of just kind of going to that Job Centre Plus that we were talking about in the previous question and just trying to find people with the basic skills. I wasn't looking for people who had the advanced skills for the printing equipment. I was looking for people who were able to simply perform the tasks. And actually, I think there's a lot to be said for getting back to a curriculum which does that, so people come out with some basic disciplines. Now, poetry and reciting poems actually is an exercise in remembering things, being able to commit things to memory, use that information later on. It's not about the poem itself, it's about the skill that you learn whilst you're doing it.
Greg Dyke.
I know an awful lot of Under Milkwood. I think we'll pretend that's poetry. And I've bored people to death with it for years, to the extent that my children won't sit in the same room when I start on again about being Bessie Bighead. I'm not sure we should elect politicians to decide the curriculums in school. I'm the Chancellor of the University at York. At York we have an Institute for Effective Education which basically says what works. And it seems to me we're all hidebound, all of us, by the education we have, where we came from, what we believe in, our politics. And I would much rather we looked and said, OK, what works? What actually is effective in teaching kids mathematics, in teaching kids to read and write at an early age? Let's look at what's effective and put it into place. Let's not... But if we're going to change this every 5 years as another government comes in, it's pretty depressing.
From your point of view, does Gove have a strategy, or is he just meddling?
Oh, I think he probably has a strategy, but it is meddling.
Farron.
I can remember the words to just about every song off every album The Clash ever made. And why? Because I found it rewarding and interesting and it got me excited and all the rest of it. And the way to get kids to remember anything is to make it rewarding and interesting and exciting for them at whatever age. I think, you know, for my kids, I trust the teachers at our school in Millthorpe in Cumbria and their head teacher to decide the priorities for what my kids should learn, rather than some boffin in Whitehall. I'm not having a go at Gove.
You aren't having a go at Gove?
I wasn't calling him the boffin in Whitehall.
But what about the Secretary of State in Whitehall?
Well, I mean, it's fine to fly kites, but, you know, I'm a
This
politician.
isn't a kite. This is, he says, this is going to be introduced in September 2014.
Well, I mean, what we've done is actually, I mean, the coalition government has reduced the size of the national curriculum to give more choice to teachers. And I would just question Michael Gove's consistency in that case, given that, you know, we are trying to reduce the burdens on teachers, allow them to teach, concentrate on what they're good at. Politicians should set general terms of debate. We should not be meddling in the classroom.
OK. The woman there in the third row.
I just wonder why Michael Gove is wasting money on a new curriculum when all the country's schools are going to become academies and won't have to follow it anyway.
Emily Thornberry.
James Morrison, Wetherby George Dupree, took great care of his mother.
That'd be enough, thank you very much.
It's the best effort so far.
I think that I think that a lot of the contributions that have been made so far are right. I think that it is not the job of politicians to meddle in the minutiae of the curriculum. I think that it is important. I think that the league tables were important. I think that it is important for parents to be reassured that children are spending a certain amount of time a week on the basics. But I think otherwise, politicians should listen to the experts, and the experts are teachers. And we have excellent teachers out there, and we should trust them.
Do you see behind what Gove is on about, and he's talked about other things, hasn't he? Our island story is a way of teaching history and things. Is it trying to provoke a debate, or does he actually...
I mean, I think quite clearly, Gove in the, whenever it was, 60s or 70s, had a childhood that he clearly enjoyed, and he clearly enjoyed being at school. And I think that he looks at our modern schools and wants to kind of somehow or other import in education that, frankly, is largely out of date. I don't think that learning the names of the kings and queens of England is the most important thing to learn in history. I think you need to have an understanding of why we are where we are. If you don't understand your history, you are doomed to continue to make the same mistakes. So I think we've got a lot to learn from history, not just learning the names of the kings and queens. But if you listen to Gove, that's the kind of thing that he wants, because that's the sort of thing that was being done in the schools in the 50s and 60s. We have moved on since then.
The woman in the front row there.
I teach 5-year-olds, and we've been doing poetry, and they love exploring it, they love reading it, they love writing it, their own, etc., etc. Making them sit down and recite poems would just be a waste of my time and a waste of their time. And I would love Michael Gove to actually come into school and try and teach 5-year-olds poetry and see what he gets.
One of the first things that David Cameron did when he came to power was commission Frank Field to do a report on early years provision, which has been widely ignored. Sure Start has been cut. And now Mr Gove is suggesting that children are taught French or Spanish because that's where they go on holiday.
Yes.
The children that I see and advise on don't get holidays. They don't go to France and Spain. They need good education from the age of 3, and like I said, and not to have things like Sure Start cut.
Okay. And the man there in the third row from that,
I think the problem with what Michael Gove said is that we're teaching kids just to learn facts, and we're placing too much stress on teachers and the children to pass these exams, rather than teaching them to actually be good, upstanding members of society.
Peter Hitchens, are you in favour of these proposals that Michael Gove puts forward?
You don't want me to pass this test?
Well, all right, you can spell accommodate.
Okay.
Spell accommodate.
A-double-C-O-double-M-A-O-D-A-T-E. But I'll do your poem as well, because I've been asked to. Into my heart an air that kills from yon far country blows. What are those blue remembered hills? What spires, what farms are those? It is the land of lost content. I see it shining plain, those happy highways where I went and cannot come again. And I'm very pleased. I'm very pleased that my head is full of things like that, and also lots of hymns which I remember, and I feel very sorry for anybody who hasn't had the chance to learn them. And I think it is a great condemnation of our school system that so few people, and particularly only those whose parents are rich, can actually afford to have their children taught things like that and have their minds furnished with beauty for the remainder of their lives. And to pour scorn on it and to say that it is unimportant is to declare yourself a spiritual desert. Of course people need these things, and what's more, they're a profound part of being British. If you don't know the literature and the poetry and the music of your own country, then you aren't really fully conversant with its history or its character. You've lost touch with what your ancestors knew, and you won't be able to pass it on to your own children and grandchildren. Of course these things should be taught. I wish Michael Gove actually had the power and the policies to make it happen. I really do think it would be a good thing. I also think that people particularly teachers, should not say that these things don't matter. They matter immensely.
I recently ran an author talk for primary school children in Hartlepool, and they were asked to bring in a short story to read to me, and the level of talent they all showed at under 11 years old in both their writing and their reading was absolutely fantastic. So clearly the system that we've got in place is working, so why are we trying to change it?
And you don't think these are improvements, these proposals?
Not necessarily. I mean,
No?
the
Okay.
children that I was with on that day they could all read very well, they could all write absolutely fantastically. So what they're learning in school is clearly helping them. They've still got good imagination, they're able to write, they're able to read, they're able to create things. So clearly they're learning the things that they're going to need later in life.
Okay. I think we'll move on. We've got a question from Sue Jeffrey I'd like to have, please. From Sue Jeffrey.
Is it right that only rich foreigners will have the right to live with their partners in this country?
These are the new proposals announced by the Home Secretary Theresa May, that you have to earn £18,600 a year, I think it is, before you can bring a partner into the country or family into the country. Is that right? Tim Farron.
I mean, it strikes me that it's important that you've got, rules and regulations to deal with immigration, but it's also right that that is compassionate. I mean, I represent a part of the world which is not hugely diverse, but the majority of immigration casework I deal with are not people who are trying it on with the system, not people trying to get round our borders and to do anything at all nefarious. They're couples who want to be together, for pity's sake. And it strikes me that if you want to try and regulate, there are issues to do with immigration which I'm sure do need to be dealt with, but this seems to me a very, very wrong way of going about it. We should be looking at whether or not people have got a home together, a future together, whether they love one another. We should not be separating families, we should be supporting them.
You're president of the Liberal Democrats. It seems to me you couldn't be invited to join this coalition government because you disagree with almost everything they're doing.
I don't. I don't disagree. I reserve my right to express my opinion on
I haven't heard you support one policy yet this evening. I don't know why you should, but I haven't heard you.
I regularly do, but people tend to listen when I disagree.
Oh, I see. That's the motive. Emily Thornberry.
Yes, I mean, I suppose I speak as a constituency MP in an area in inner London where we have a great mixture of people. I mean, Islington has people from all over the world, and I have to say some of the most memorable cases that come into my surgery are, I'm just thinking, I have in the forefront of my mind as we've been thinking about this, 3 Somali women, three separate women who've come here as refugees and who are trying to get their children over to this country. And their children, they may have brought a couple of their children, but a couple more are under a tree in Somalia without anything. And I have to advise all of them that they must get a job. They have to be able to support the children. Many of these women are not used to working. But 2 of them, I can tell you, have got a job. One of them has got 2 jobs, and so she is able to show that she can support these children and is in the process of trying to get them over here. I am concerned, though, that the ambitions of these women will be completely quashed if we keep raising the bar for them, because they do need to get their families together, and frankly, it is to the benefit of all of us.
So are you in favour of this new proposal or against it?
So I think it is a question of degree. I mean, the other side of the coin, obviously, and I understand this too, is we don't want to have people saying, well, I need all my family coming over, and then for them to simply depend on all of us and to depend on the state. So they need to be able to stand on their feet, but there needs to be, I think, more compassion in many of these individual cases. And my experience as an MP getting in touch with the Home Office is that they don't use their discretion enough. They don't give sufficient regard to these brave women who are doing their best.
Are you in favour or against the proposal?
I think that it is, as I say, it is something which is, it is a question of degree, and at the moment there is an internal debate in the Labour Party as to where that should be. So, speaking as a front bencher, I can't tell you what the Labour Party's policy is in terms of the degree yet, but I can tell you the experience that I feed into that debate, which is the experience of my constituents.
So the party hasn't made up its mind.
Well, the proposals came out about 3 days ago. I mean, give us a chance, And we want to make sure that we get this absolutely right, because we are, we're not playing games. We're talking about people's lives.
Hi, I work in the immigration sector myself, and the ladies that you talk about, if they're getting their children from abroad anyway and they've been granted refugee status, they don't actually have to meet the maintenance requirements at all.
Yeah.
But it's more due to the families the working class families who don't simply earn enough money to be able to meet that bar, and the fact that they have a husband abroad, they have 2 children in the UK, it rises from the 18,600 to a lot more.
Yeah, I'm sorry, it's my fault. That's my sloppy language. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, they came here as refugees, but they were not recognised as refugees, so they then had to get exceptional leave to remain, and now they've got indefinite leave to remain, and now they've got their British citizenship, and now they've got to get jobs, and then they can get their kids over. So these are all the things that they've already had to jump, and then the question is...
What do you think of the proposal?
I think it's ludicrous that they're having to, especially as low-skilled jobs. Not everyone's got a degree and can get lots of high-paid jobs, and I think 18,600 for just a spouse to get here, and then obviously the children can get just 27,500 for a family of 4.
Grant Shapps.
Yeah, first of all, let's just be clear, this isn't about the asylum system. This country's got a very proud long record on asylum. That's not what we're talking about here. What we are talking about is the fact that under the system that exists at the moment, if you want to bring another member of the family in, you only have to be in receipt of £5,600 a year, for which you can bring anybody else into the country, and once you've done that, they'll have to be provided with services the same way as anyone else who lives here. And somewhere along the line, the rest of the population needs to pay for this. So I think a very reasonable proposal, which I really hope that your party will support, is to have a level of 18,600, the level that we've introduced, to say that actually you need to be going out earning money yourself, so that when you bring somebody into the country, that person isn't then relying off everybody else to provide the services to that individual. Now, I think there's a very, very strong argument for that. It's part of a series of different things that we're doing in order to make sure that actually access to this country comes with provisions, including, for example, learning English.
I would just be interested in hearing Peter's opinion on this, considering his previously expressed views about fatherless families.
Well,
Peter,
I don't actually see what the two have to do with each other, but we do.
Well, hang on. Explain what the two have to do with each other.
Just when he was previously saying that fatherless families were a large part of the described problem families, and how he would couple that view with the need for the rich spouse, spouses to
People should be able to bring their...
Yeah, so it's got nothing to do with it, but I'll answer the question anyway. The point here is actually a much deeper one. Emily Thornberry's party, as we now know because of the astonishing revelations of Andrew Nether, a former New Labour worker, deliberately hoped to transform this country through mass immigration during its time in office, and has very largely succeeded in doing so, as people in many parts of this country know very well. The extent of the transformation by mass immigration is unprecedented in our national history. The Conservative Party pretends to be against this, but also knows deep down that unless particularly we leave the European Union, it has no power to act on this matter. So every so often, word goes out from our Prime Minister, Mr. Slippery, to his ministers, to say, will you come up with something which sounds conservative, because we're losing too many votes to UKIP. And so out comes Eric Pickles with his stuff about problem families, and out comes Theresa May with her guidelines about immigration. I promise you, none of these things will happen. There will be no difference. The mass immigration will continue at its unprecedented levels. The country will continue to be transformed. If you're in favour of that, then that's fine. What my problem is, nobody was ever asked about whether we wanted this. And by the time we discovered that it had happened, it was too late to do anything about it. And I really do think people should be a little bit more discontented about that than they are.
Okay.
Thank you.
I just wanted to pick up the point that Emily made about what the Labour Party's position on all this is, because I'm a Labour Party member, and I would hope that the Labour Party's position is going to be one of compassion on this, the point that you made yourself, and I would hope that we wouldn't be prevaricating about it too long.
Does that mean opposition to it?
Absolutely, and we will come out very clearly about saying that without, as I say, having to go through a great huge policy review and getting very convoluted about what I think is a very simple thing. We shouldn't be supporting this initiative.
Emily Thornberry?
Well, I mean, I think that you speak on behalf of a large number of people in the Labour Party, but I think that, you know, there are people who have the opposite view, and it's something that we need to resolve as a party. The good thing is that we are a party that does have quite a lot of debate, but we tend to have it behind the scenes, so I'm happy to speak to you afterwards about it. But, I mean, I think it's something that we have to resolve as a party. But, you know, we've only just heard it, and we need to make sure that we get, you know, we get our response exactly right.
Do you have your debates behind the scenes? I thought you were...
Yeah, we do.
You mean you don't... I'm amazed.
Yeah, we have a policy forum this weekend, and that will be behind the scenes. I have an opinion, yeah. I think you can probably tell what my opinion is. You can probably tell what my opinion is, but as I say, I'm here as a constituency MP and a frontbench MP as well, so, you know.
Greg Dyke.
18,650 seems quite a lot of money to me. It's not a lot of money in some parts of the country, it's an awful lot in others. If what we were saying is we are going to keep husband and wife, genuine married couples, apart until they can earn that sort of money, then I find it offensive.
The point about it is it's the point at which you stop being able to claim benefit automatically, 18,600. So in other words, if you get 18,600, you won't get benefit. That's the point, isn't it?
I'm absolutely amazed by that. I'm almost amazed there's any debate about it. Surely, if somebody is going to come into the country who doesn't live here at the moment, it's right that the person bringing them in is able to pay for them, so everybody else doesn't have to. Simple as that.
The woman there.
Can UK PLC afford to be compassionate?
Can who afford to be?
UK PLC afford to be compassionate?
What's your view?
I think that if we're having so much trouble with our problem families and we want to put money into everything, we can't afford to take on the problems of the world. We're not as rich and powerful as we think we are.
OK. I'm going to... We've got a couple of minutes only left, and I want us to bring up this question, which we did touch on very earlier on, from Azar Aladad, if we could have that, please.
Is it right that all our emails and Facebook messages can be viewed by the police and security services in the new communication day bill that was announced earlier on this morning?
OK, the new announcement that emails and Facebook messages can all be viewed by the police. You have to be very brief on this. Peter Hitchens, I'll start with you. Be quick if you would.
No, it's absolutely wrong. It's terribly dangerous. Governments should never have this much power over us, and it seems to me that the more we fail to control crime and disorder in this country, the more powers the government accrues to itself to survey and interfere in the lives of the innocent. And I think that it is a very, very serious threat to liberty, and it should be resisted by everybody with spirit.
Greg Dyke.
I agree with Peter entirely. I think it's very dangerous for governments to constantly give additional powers to the police, which often are used in a far wider way than there's the intention when they're put into place. So I agree with Peter. I think individual liberty says that I should be entitled to privacy.
Grant Shapps.
Well, I'd never support the proposal as it sounded in the question that emails and content of Facebook would be available. That's not actually what's in this draft bill today. What it says in the bill is that the fact that a communication has taken place, not what is in that communication, and only under exceptional circumstances and entirely retrospectively, should be available to the police if they want to investigate crimes of very serious nature, for example, like the paedophile ring that was broken last week in Rochdale, or rather the men went to prison, or cases of terrorism. And these are exactly the same things which are already available, by the way, for mobile phone records and for any other telephone. Nowadays, the internet is where that traffic takes place, and you just need to have some connection to it.
You're the Shadow Attorney General.